Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of February 22nd to 28th, 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host Jean Deville, with this being the first of several weeks that will be the Hong Kong quarantine edition of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. I have the tracking wristband to prove it, so the Hong Kong government knows exactly where I am at all times. Before diving into this week's updates, we would like to send a couple of special shout-outs to our good friends at Go Taikonauts and at spacewatch.global, two excellent sources for space industry news. One last point on spacewatch.global, I will be giving a quarantine edition Space Cafe web talk Tuesday of this week, so March 2nd, and that will be at 4 p.m. Central European time. So if you are interested in some more quarantine-related China space industry discussion, happy to see you there. This week on the China Aerospace and Space News Roundup, we will discuss some updates on China's Long March 9 Super Heavy Lift rocket, a China commercial space investment report published by FutureSpace. But first, Jean will bring us an update of Xi Jinping and the Politburo Standing Committee visiting the Chang'e-5 Exhibition at the Great Hall of the People.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
Take it away, Jean, with Xi Jinping and the Politburo and Chang'e-5.
Sure, Blaine. So, a couple days ago on February the 22nd, Xi Jinping visited an exhibition at the Great Hall of the People that was dedicated to Chang'e-5. And he met up with a lot of the top-level Chinese space apparatus and also a lot of teams that were in charge of designing and operating the Chang'e-5. And so there was an exhibition, there were a lot of points of interest on, for example, the launch system, there were miniature modules of Chang'e-5, the propulsion, this sort of stuff. And after that, there was a group picture and there was a speech. And so on paper, it looked quite ordinary, but actually there are quite a few interesting things here to unpack and discuss. And I think the first one here is, first of all, this is one of the, well, I wouldn't exactly say rare, but I mean, it's one of the appearances that we've seen so far of Xi Jinping publicly supporting and very strongly the Chinese space industry. I think the last time we saw this was in 2019, where, actually Xi Jinping did sort of the same thing at the end of the Chang'e-4 mission. So there was also an event at the Great Hall of the People. And before that, I think that would be in 2016 with Shenzhou 11. So that was a mission that included sending taikonauts that would rendezvous with the Tiangong-2 experimental space station. And so, yeah, I think that's the first point. And the other interesting point, and Blaine, you've mentioned a little bit, is that it wasn't only Xi Jinping that was present, it was actually the entire standing committee of the Politburo. And so basically what that is the six most powerful people in China after Xi Jinping. So definitely a very strong support that's shown for the Chinese space exploration program. And there were also a lot of high profile people, as mentioned, of the Chinese space industry. So we had, for example, Wu Yansheng, the head of CASC. We had Yang Mengfei, the chief designer of Chang'e-5. We had Wang Jue for Long March 5. We had also Zhang Kejian, who's the president of CNSA, and who I believe, when you look at the photos, who seems to be the guy who's giving the private tour to Xi Jinping and explaining all the details for each points of interest of the exhibition. And last point, and we see this on the photos, we also had people like Sun Jiadong and Luo Nenjie. So these guys are sort of the historical figures of the Chinese space program. They were leading a lot of the earlier large-scale Chinese space projects. And so I mean, Sun Jiadong, for example, I think he is still officially the chief designer of the Chinese lunar exploration program, but I think that's more symbolic. The guy is 92 years old. He was born in 1929. So I think China likes putting forward some of these historical figures to just put stress on how important, how historical the moment of Chang'e-5 is for China. And just last thing before handing it over to you, Blaine, during Xi Jinping's speech, there were some interesting points, notably when he mentioned that that China had completed the 3-step lunar exploration mission, so building an orbiter, It's also two orbiters, achieving also rovers and landers, and also a moon sample return mission. And that now China had to put full force behind what was to come next, the phase 4, which consisted in Chang'e 6, 7, and 8, and also the ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station, which we discussed in the past episode, and which is really one step further in China's lunar space program. So nice support shown by Xi Jinping for China's lunar exploration program.
For sure. And I mean, really, it's impressive to see all 7 members of the Politburo Standing Committee at one event about Chang'e-5. So definitely a noteworthy development. I continue to stand by my general assertion that I don't see Xi Jinping as being a real kind of, quote, fan of space, in the sense that I don't know to what extent this is actually an interest of his. But it is becoming increasingly clear that Xi Jinping and that the Politburo Standing Committee, or the party more generally, are seeing space as a tool for soft power and for China having kind of a larger role in the international order, as it were. And this really kind of stood out from a couple of different lines in President Xi's speech during this visit to Chang'e-5. So a couple of things he mentioned. So President Xi noted that, quote, exploring the vast universe is humanity's common dream, and urged implementing the 4th phase of China's lunar exploration program. Xi also called for giving full play to the advantages of the new system of pooling national resources and strengths, enhancing independent innovation, etc. And finally, he did mention, he stressed actively conducting international cooperation and making better contributions to humanity's well-being. So I think this is definitely one of those things where China and the Chinese leadership recognizes that what they are doing is quite difficult. I mean, Chang'e-5 was a very complicated mission, and is quite inspirational for other people from other countries, and is, again, probably doing some relatively small part in putting China in a more kind of prominent role in globally in general. I would also point out that I had seen previously Xi Jinping go to different, Chang'e-4, and as Jean mentioned, other such kind of Chinese space program missions. But I think that this also brought back a little bit the time that Xi Jinping went to Inmarsat in 2015, and he was talking about building a Belt and Road satellite using one of the Inmarsat Global Express satellites, and having a kind of a satellite to link together this entire part of the world. So yeah, a lot of interesting points in the speech by Xi Jinping, and again, I think an indication that the Chinese Politburo, the Communist Party more generally, does see space and the space programs that they are doing as a way of increasing China's prestige or clout on the global stage. So I guess the main takeaways here from my perspective, and then Jean, I'll let you go into the Long March 9 update, which we're very excited to hear about, are just the extent to which the very, very highest level of the Chinese leadership, so again, the 7 most powerful people in the country, have clearly identified space as a means for international cooperation and economic development and increasing patriotism, this kind of thing. So John, to your earlier point about Sun Jiadong and Luan Enjie, I mean, you notice in the group photo that you have Xi Jinping in the front center, yes, and then flanking him on either side are these 2 90-year-old men that you mentioned, and then you have the rest of the Politburo. So you have this very, it almost reminds me of the New Year's, the Lunar New Year Gala from a few weeks ago, where we saw the 4 CASC employees come out and just look very humble and hardworking and patriotic and just ready to serve their country in whatever way they can. So certainly a PR win, probably, and again, an indication of China's increasing goals in the space sector on the global stage. So definitely an interesting update, the Politburo visiting Chang'e-5.
Yeah, and following this event on February the 22nd, a couple days later, I think this was not unrelated, we had Wu Yansheng, who's the deputy director of CNSA, be interviewed by CCTV, China's central television, and during which he officially confirmed that the development of the Long March 9 was going to go through, notably for lunar and Martian missions. And this is an important piece of news in many regards. The first one is we finally have the confirmation of Long March 9 going to go through, because China's been talking about this rocket for many, many, many years. I think it goes all the way back to 2010 10, where there was discussion of a super heavy Chinese rocket. And this was at a time where Long March 5 was still under development. And in between 2010 and all the way to now, we've seen multiple presentations by CNSA and academies of CASC with mention of this rocket. And we've seen actually that the configuration of the rocket had evolved over time. And initially, China was exploring mostly hydrolox or liquid-fueled engines for the second stage and the first stage, and we'd have also solid-fueled rocket boosters. But rapidly, China moved to another configuration where we'd only have Kerolox engines for the core stage and the side boosters, and you have Hydrolox only for the second stage. And so multiple evolutions in terms of technology, in terms of just payload capacity, total weight, and so that's changed a lot. And also the names of these different components also changed quite a bit, as is often the case in the Chinese space program. So what we have here today in terms of the latest characteristics of Long March 9 is that the Long March 9 will be a rocket that will put 140 tons into low Earth orbit and 50 tons into lunar transfer injection. And I've also seen online some recent slides that show an extended version of Long March 9 that's 103 meters instead of 93, and that would put 180 tons into LEO instead of 140. But basing on what was showed to Xi Jinping a couple days ago, they showed a poster with 140 tons. So I'm going to stick to that figure. And so just to go really quickly through the configuration. So 140 tons, that would be the Long March 9 with its 4 side boosters configuration. But you would also have a Long March 9A with only 2 side boosters. That would reduce, I think, the payload to 100 tons into LEO. And then if you take those last 2 side boosters away, you end up with only the core stage, the second stage, and the upper stage. And then you have a payload capacity into LEO of I think, 50 tons. And so what is maybe remarkable here in terms of technology for the Long March 9 is when you look at the first stage, the core stage and the booster engines, it's a Kerolox engine called the YF-130. And so this is a new generation engine. Its architecture is what is called a dual combustion, dual nozzle, oxygen-rich, staged combustion engine. So what this means, this is an architecture that's extremely fuel efficient, although at the cost of complexity. It has, I believe, a specific impulse of 306 seconds at sea level. It resembles a bit the Russian RD-180. And this just shows China's increased knowledge and mastery of liquid-fueled Kerolox engines. And it's also one step up from the much lower thrust YF-100 that was developed for the Long March 5. And I think the other engine that's worth looking at is the engine of the second stage called the YF-90. It's a 220-ton thrust Hydrolox engine, and very similar to the YF-130 that I just mentioned. This is a very fuel efficient architecture. It's a single pre-chamber, parallel, even double pumps architecture. I'm not sure what exactly that means, but I'll put up the schematics on the video if any rocket savvy viewers can explain that a little bit to us. But basically, it's a much more fuel efficient, although complex architecture, much beyond what China was capable of previously, which was the YF-77, which is the Hydrolox engine of the Long March 5. And so for the YF-90 for Long March 9, we're looking at a specific impulse at a vacuum level of 453 seconds. And that really brings the engine almost to the level of some of the most efficient Hydrolox engines of history, which is probably the RS-25 that powered the space shuttle. So anyway, Long March 9 is not expected until 2030, but we know that China is already working on these 2 engines, the development of these 2 engines. Space News reported in 2019 that China was already assembling the first YF-130 for tests. And we also reported last month in the Dongfang Hour Aerospace News Roundup that China was also doing tests with the pre-burner of the YF-90. And so last point worth mentioning, I think, here is that when Wu Yanhua did his interview to CCTV, he insisted on the fact that the rocket was meant for, 载人登月 and 载人登火. And so what this means crewed lunar missions and crewed Martian missions. And it's interesting that he insists here on crewed because obviously there's been a lot of discussion on what Long March 9 would be for, obviously lunar and Mars missions, but it could be Mars sample return. And there were also even discussions on some of the very high profile, very heavy payload missions, such as China's hypothetical space-based solar harvesting mission. We spoke a little bit about this in episode 5 or 6, I think, of Dongfang Hour. So I'll put a link in the description. And so anyway, so it's interesting that, the focal point was put here on crude. And last point, I think this also puts into question the role that will have the so-called 921 rocket that China has unveiled more or less in some presentations since 2019, which was seen as an alternative and less complex, less heavy rocket to the Long March 9 and using existing technology, and notably the YF-100. Will China continue to develop this rocket? Will China develop 2 rockets in parallel for lunar and Martian missions? This is yet unclear, but what is for sure is that the Long March 9 is going to the moon, and for the 921 rocket, we'll probably have to wait a bit and keep our eyes open for any pieces of news.
It's a big update, the official confirmation of the Long March 9. I mean, this would really, granted, as you said, this is not until 2030 or so we're still quite a ways off. But, I mean, taking a step back, if China were to successfully develop the Long March 9 in the way that they have that you've just described, that they've described, this would really, I think it would make China, in addition to like the US and SpaceX, really the only country or sort of a space program, you could say, that has the capability of sending human missions to Mars and potentially to the moon and potentially to Mars. So definitely, I think that the official announcement of the Long March 9 is just another example of China and of the government at a high level supporting the sector. And I think the explicit mention of human missions to the moon and Mars is probably, it could be many things, but at least probably it is partly because that's a big kind of nationalistic, inspirational thing. And again, if you're another country and you want to send some people to Mars or the moon, you'll have 2 options, it looks like. And so I think that's significant. I think that really would set China apart from a lot of other leading space nations. So again, a very, very interesting update, the Long March 9. John, you covered it very thoroughly, so I don't have a whole lot more to add. So anything else from your side, or shall we move into the FutureSpace's 2020 investment report? All right. So we saw a very comprehensive report released earlier this week by Chinese space industry think tank and event organizer FutureSpace. So there's a few major takeaways. So basically, the report was covering the investment into Chinese commercial space in 2020. Similar to data published by Euroconsult late last year, we did see that 2020 actually surpassed 2019 in terms of Chinese commercial space sector funding. Now, FutureSpace had a larger number for 2020, which could be due to more liberal estimations for rounds of funding that did not specify the amount. But consistent across both reports was more funding and a smaller number of rounds, which is to imply that you have a few very big rounds that are taking up a disproportionate amount of funding, and as a result, a few very big companies that are taking up a disproportionate amount of funding. So we'll discuss that more here in a moment. But I guess the next major takeaway was the type of funding, and this is also consistent with the decreased number of rounds. We also saw a change in the type of funding in 2020, I would say. So the report covers about 9 billion RMB of total commercial space investment in 2020. And during that year, only about 350 million of that 9 billion went into seed rounds or angel rounds or pre-A rounds. So basically, we're looking at 4% or so of the total funding going into early stage companies. And this is a marked change from as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. We've also, we saw in this report that strategic investment rounds occupy a very large share of the total funding. So it was almost a third or possibly 40% of the funding. This is not particularly surprising given that the strategic investment rounds tend to involve either a more mature company or a larger financier or a combination of both. So I think from that perspective, it's interesting that these strategic investments have continued to see growth. There's also I think this is also probably a large contributor to the delta between FutureSpace and Euroconsult's figures. So again, these strategic investment rounds, they oftentimes do not specify the amount of funding. It's often kind of, it sometimes might even be that it's not even necessarily money, but rather some land or some tax incentives. So certainly an interesting development to see that strategic investment rounds, had such a large increase over the course of 2020. one last highlight from my side. Two last highlights from my side. So the first one, Beijing clearly remains the undisputed king of space industry funding in China. So we had about a little more than 5 billion RMB out of the 9 billion RMB in total going towards companies that are headquartered in Beijing. That said, we did see a couple of other big outliers. So Changchun saw 2.6 billion RMB of funding, with that almost entirely from CGSTL's massive pre-IPO round. We also saw Xi'an come into the top 3 with 537 million RMB in funding across 2 rounds during the year. So just a final point from my side is it would appear that CGSTL's pre-IPO round was considered a strategic investment in the FA report, because that's really, I think, the only way that the strategic investment figure could be so large, and they also did not have a pre-IPO round as a category. Now, whether or not this distinction is hugely important is secondary. The main takeaway, I think, is just the subjectivity of the Chinese space sector. You have a lot of room for interpretation and a lot of just sort of uncertainty in general. So yeah, I mean, certainly it's an excellent report, a lot of good takeaways and a lot of nuggets of insight to be derived. So Jean, what are your thoughts on the FutureSpace 2020 report?
I think more on a side note here, it's interesting to put into perspective the investments into Chinese space in 2020 with just the global investment, VC investment in China. And while we see that the investment in Chinese space has continued to increase in 2019 and 2020, it's actually the opposite that has been happening in terms of VC investment just globally in China. Notably, China reached a peak after, just increasing in terms of VC investment in 2016, 2017, and 2018 before dropping in 2019, 2020. So I think it's noteworthy that space is considered by Chinese investors as a worthwhile, a trustworthy investment. And this is just a more general trend where we've seen investors be much more keen on a lot more deep tech investments, such as AI, and space is one of them, rather than a lot of those big, shiny B2C VC investment that we saw in 2016, 2017, 2018, and some of which, didn't go too well, although some others are definitely doing very well as well. So space tech definitely considered as, a good investment by Chinese investors.
Indeed. Well, nothing else from my side, and I'm starting to feel a little bit ill because I've had a 40-hour journey that got me to this hotel about 4 hours ago. So I think with that, we are going to wrap up this Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup for the week of the 22nd to 28th of February 2021. Also the first quarantine edition of the DFH China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. As always, I'm Blaine Curcio, joined by my co-host Jean Deville, and I will look forward to seeing you next week from this exact same chair, in this exact same room, because I'm not going anywhere between here and now. Thank you very much for your time. Have a good week.
Thanks for watching.